actually Lizadel, but that was close enough.
Oh, Lizadel. That's a cool name. Sweet. Well, I will. So yeah, apologize for I gave out the link for next week on accident. So I'm glad you guys were able to find the right one. I'm gonna give people a couple more minutes and then we'll get started. So I'm doing CSS stuff today, which is actually the first time I've done CSS stuff for Code Talk. Normally I do more JavaScript related stuff, but this will tie into JavaScript as well. But yeah, hopefully this will be useful. I think it'll be fun.
While we wait for others, is it okay if I ask you another question?
Absolutely, go ahead.
So I'm reviewing all of the stuff that I did previously, and I ran into the node calculator, which I remember it was a really easy assignment. I cannot find a way to like make it work. I have the readline. I'm using readline sync, all of that, but I don't know. And I was wondering if you could show me an example of how to do that, how to get the input and make it do the operation.
Oh yeah,
that
sure.
I want to.
Do you have time after the code talk? I'd be happy to take a look at it.
Of course, yeah.
Cool. Yeah,
Thank
definitely. You. I'm sure there's just like one little step you're missing.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I don't know, my brain is just it's too cold.
I know how that goes. Let's see here. Lizadel, are you a V-School student or are you here from Career Karma?
I'm a V-School student.
Okay, cool.
I started like 3 weeks ago.
Nice. How do you like it so far?
It's good. It's good. I actually just finished the Node.js, so.
Okay.
So if you need help with that, like direct, help you sessions and so fresh with it. So.
All right.
I just started and now I'm stuck on debugger. So and I thought I'd take a break and listen to get a refresher on the
cool
CSS box.
Hey, Emily.
Hey.
What's up?
Dude, Emily.
What's up, dude? That car, right?
I crashed my car.
No.
Dude, it was so icy on Saturday night. I wasn't even going fast. I literally was at a stop sign and I like just, went into first and then it just started sliding and I couldn't stop and I was in the Avs and I just slid and hit a tree. I had that car for 4 days.
Oh.
But I was able to.
Okay.
I'm okay. I hit my head pretty hard, but I wasn't bleeding.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, it hurt pretty bad though. I thought I had like a concussion, but
you probably do.
I think I'm okay though. Like I'm not like dizzy. My head doesn't actually hurt. So
you didn't like puke or anything?
No.
Like unfocused, blurry. No. What are the other symptoms? I don't know.
Yeah,
oh man,
I forget all of them, but yeah, I'm so sad.
we like totally timed that walk perfectly. It just like all of a sudden started like, I don't know what this is. It's not rain. It's not snow. It's not really even sleet. Just like falling from the sky, white bits. Nice. Well, shoot. Is it like obvious? I mean, it's not totaled, is it?
I don't think so. The tow shop was closed today, so I couldn't go get it. But I couldn't drive it out because the whole driver's side door is just completely shattered. So I'm gonna have to get the door replaced. The bottom frame I think was bent a little bit, but like I didn't hit a wheel, I didn't pop a curb or anything. Like I think it's isolated just to the door. I'll find out tomorrow.
Yeah, but... and it wasn't any engine or anything like that. That's
no.
So here's a really funny story. Once in mine, I was driving along and out of nowhere, so I was driving on this like mountain road that had a big hill, like a mountainside on the side, and it must have been that this like elk or incredibly large deer came like hopping off of it, and it went to like go hop into the road, but I
my
was like
God.
simultaneously coming, and it hopped onto the top of my car, and it
Oh my God,
landed
dude.
in my windshield. So like it suppressed almost to like my face, the shoulder and the butt of this like elk. The guy said it was an elk, but I don't know. I think if it was an elk, it would have come
Man,
through.
that would be awful.
And I like scooped it, and it was horrible. But moral of the story is you can do a lot of damage that isn't really a lot of damage. So
Right.
hopefully that's your case.
Yeah, I don't think anything like structural or engine wise or like functional wise broke. I
Yeah.
was able to like back it out onto the tow truck and stuff.
Had it been like 10 more inches on top of the hood, it would have
Mhm.
just hammered like everything.
Oh
But
yeah.
it got like windshield, and then I mean
Wow.
it did ruin. We had like a one of those like, you know, little boxes on top,
Yeah.
a Thule, and it totally like crushed that. But
That's crazy. That's scary.
that was wild. Ah, man, I'm so sorry.
It's all right. It's
Doesn't matter
worse.
how many wheels are in action when there's ice like that.
Yeah, yeah. If it's sliding,
That's when
then-
you need the button that just like spits out spikes.
Yeah, I know, right? Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I need to.
Wow, that's heavy. I'm sorry.
That's all right. It's all right.
I'm glad you're okay.
Yeah, me
The
too.
car can be repaired.
Yeah, it's just a car, so it's
Yeah.
all good. Cool. All right. Well, let's do this thing.
What's up, John?
So today's topic is a little different than usual. We're going to talk about some CSS tips and tricks. So let me open up. Oh, I'm in the wrong folder. Let me create a new one. CSS box model. Okay. Oh, let me share my screen. All right. Can you guys see this okay?
Yes.
All right, cool. All right, so just to set this up, I'm not going to do anything crazy. We're going to make a style sheet and an HTML file. And I'm going to get this set up, and then I'll kind of do a little intro on what I want to talk about today. Let's add the link CSS here, styles. Okay, then we'll do like an H1. Or actually, let's just do it simpler. Hello. I keep getting spam calls. I gotta turn my phone off. Okay. Okay, let's run this guy. Sweet. Okay. Hello, everybody. So the box model is what we're talking about today, but we're also going to talk about some ways to write better CSS. So we're going to exploit kind of the way that CSS works to try to write better CSS. And for me, the less CSS I have to write, the better, because I hate CSS. I much prefer building servers than making things look pretty. I don't care about looks. It's like that Seinfeld episode, looks aren't that important to me. I don't know if you guys have seen that. But CSS is really important, obviously, if you are a web developer, because it's what makes your site, look good. It's, the layout and stuff is very important for conveying information. And when you're writing CSS, you want to write it just like in JavaScript or any other programming language. You want to write quality code. And there is such a thing as bad quality CSS and good quality CSS. So we're going to hopefully talk about how to write good quality CSS. But before we do that, it's really important to understand the way that CSS gets applied to an HTML document. Now, we don't need to talk about how the browser like parses CSS and applies it to HTML and stuff. That there are some cool links in Google Developer something, the developer cloud or whatever. There's a lot of good information on that if you're curious about that. But when we're talking about CSS, we're talking about how is it that when we write something like this, how does it know that by doing that, by providing this color attribute to red, that it is able to then do that? Okay. Oh, welcome, Shane. So now with CSS, we're going to look at like the anatomy of CSS. So it's actually very simple. The syntax of CSS obviously is very, very simple. You simply have a selector followed by a brace, followed by a set of key value pairs, which represent the styling attributes that you want to apply to everything matching that selector. So these selectors, the reason why they're called selectors is because they are selecting DOM elements on the linked HTML page, or I should say the HTML page, the linked styles will then apply those attributes to DOM elements matching those selectors. It's really important to understand there's three basic selectors. You've got an element selector, you have a class selector, and then you have an ID selector. Those are the most common selectors. Now, there are a few different types of selectors within this guy. And what's cool is that whatever you've probably, I'm going to write a little JavaScript file here real quick. You've probably seen something like this. Query selector, input, and then name equals, some name. The selectors that are allowable to this query selector function, these are actually identical to these ones as well. So you could write input name equals some name and apply stylings, which is kind of cool. Actually, I don't, is it that way? Now I forget what the syntax is. I haven't done this in a while. Yeah, there we go. So that's cool. This allows you to, style only inputs that have a particular name, for example. But all right, we're going to zoom out for a second, and because this while it's kind of cool, kind of nifty, it falls into the same category as any other typical element selector. The reason why these are important is because it has to do, we have to really understand this concept called specificity. In CSS, there's this idea of specificity is what governs which styles should be applied to which elements. Okay, the reason why it's called specificity is because it has to do with how specific your selector is when it comes time to styling a particular element or set of elements. Does anybody have any questions so far?
Nope.
Cool. Okay, so now there's a hierarchy. Okay, so we're going to do a little example to show this hierarchy. Okay, I'm going to make an H1 tag. They're all going to be the same exact thing. Okay. This one, I'm going to give it a class of, I don't know, header. This one, in fact, no, I'm gonna do h1. And then this one, I'm gonna, instead of doing a class, I'm gonna do an ID. Okay. So I've got 3 h1 elements. They're all identical, except one of them has a class, one of them has an ID. Okay, we're gonna go to our styles here, and we're gonna play around with this. So I named them all h1 just for illustrative purposes. You probably wouldn't want to name this h1 as a class in real life, but anyways. So I'm gonna do blue. Well, actually, before I even do that, let's see what happens. So I don't have any stylings applied to anything other than h1 elements and the color's red. So as you can imagine, they're all going to be red. Okay, that shouldn't be surprising. If that's surprising, let me know and I'll be happy to explain that, but hopefully that is straightforward. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to apply in this class anything that has an h1, we're going to give it the color blue. So what I want to point out is we now have 2 conflicting styles. On one hand, we have everything that's an h1, but then we also have everything that is a class that is h1, and we're setting the same attribute, but they're being set to different values. So this is a conflict. So specificity has to do with how CSS manages these kinds of conflicts. Now, the more specific the selector, the higher priority it gets. Okay, so the lowest priority or the lowest specificity are element selectors. And the way that you can remember this is by how general they are. The more general the selector is, the less specificity it has. So a span or an h1, these are very general categories, whereas a class is more specific. And an ID is even more specific. So those are the 3 kind of basic categories of specificity that there are. Does anybody have any questions? Does that make sense? So I should, based on what we know about specificity, what color should my h1 with the class h1 be?
Blue.
Yeah, it should be blue. And there it is, it's blue. Now, welcome, Caesar. Okay, cool. So,
Hey, Ben.
how's it going? All right, so the third thing is, of course, the ID. So we gave this h1 an ID of h1, and we're going to do this. We're going to say color green. Okay, and of course, by the rules of specificity, because this h1 is more specific than the element h1, it should be green. Now I'm going to add something to show you that an ID is even more specific than a class, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to give this guy a class of h1 as well. Okay, so let me take this out really quick. So line 12 and 13, they're identical. They should both be blue. Okay, I'm going to put in this h1. Now it's overridden the class designation. So just by knowing that and like kind of mastering that concept, you will know exactly how best to organize your CSS. You need to do it by specificity. So what this means is that usually you put your most basic top level stylings into element tags. This would be things like font, font size, perhaps. Things like maybe some base level padding and border for like buttons and things like that. So because those are your most general things. These are things that should be applied to every single element of that type. Now, of course, there are other elements that we can do. You know, there's other selectors we can do. We can be like H1 and H2 or H1 and H3. There's different combinations here. But the same principle holds. These are all element selectors, so therefore their specificity is the broadest. It's the most general, so it's the lowest level of specificity possible. So when you're writing your own stylings, think about all the stylings that literally every element should have in your application, and style them accordingly, because you can always override them with more specific attributes later. So that's the pattern that you want to use with CSS. Does anybody have any questions?
I don't have a question. I just want to confirm something. I remember early on something that really stuck out and stuck with me when doing CSS. Everything that you've said, but then to take it one step further, the way I understood it and usually how I think about why I'm using a class name over an ID. When I use a class name, I was using it when I wanted like multiple things to kind of be styled that way. And when I would use an ID, I wanted that one specific thing. Would that be a good way to think of it, or is that not a great way to think of it? Because I don't want to continue because you didn't mention anything like that.
You're on the right path for sure. And we're actually gonna look at that specific situation.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But you can't use IDs in React, correct?
Of course, yeah, they're just DOM elements.
Okay.
Cool.
Kind of. Like, I think one thing to keep in mind is that if you have an element that is repeating in another element, like where you're using the map feature to repeat that element, if you use an ID, then that ID is going to exist multiple times in the same DOM.
Right, yeah.
So that's going to cause a problem.
Right, and that defeats the purpose of an ID.
Exactly, yeah. But it seems like it's only once because you're only putting it in there once, but if you're populating it more, I've made that mistake a couple times. So.
Yep, that is a very valid point. People make that mistake with IDs a lot. An ID is supposed to be, there's only one of it.
So don't use it in like a map or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So React is very quick to tell you that.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. But you can use IDs in React. Like if you use an ID to identify like a singular component that's not being, mapped through or used in multiple places, then, of course, like, but it's not really unique to React, like even building an application in vanilla JavaScript and HTML, you still would want to avoid naming multiple elements with the same ID. And it also confuses the CSS parser because it will find whatever the first instance of an ID that it selects that's what it will apply to. Because as far as it is concerned, there's only one thing of it. So I'm not trying to look for multiple things. So I'm not going to apply it like a class.
Am I correct in remembering that if there's an error in any one kind of CSS code block, inside the brackets, that it ignores all of the things in that bracket?
Well, that's a good question. Let me see. Let's do that.
Shane, can you repeat your question?
Yeah, so it looks like it.
So if like going back to his code, since he got the border wrong, I'm actually curious. Will you put a semicolon there? I'm just curious. Like
Here?
if everything else, yeah. 'Cause I know that causes its own weird thing.
Yeah.
But
so-
what I think is that because that border is wrong, it ignores everything in that H1. But it looks like it
Yeah.
didn't actually.
So let me like do something weird
Oh,
where
no,
I
you got it right. I
spell
got it.
something wrong. Like let's do like I don't know, 1pxx, which is not a real selector. So it looks like it's handling green just fine.
So maybe it's everything below
It
it.
must be everything below it.
Yeah.
Yeah, because
So
if I
if you- okay.
switch that, yeah, now it's blue. Yeah. So that's a good thing to know.
But it is cool that it continues with the rest of the CSS file. Like that's nice.
Yeah, it is cool. Now, actually, let me see what happens if I do this and I put this back to how it was with like the weird. I wonder if it applies blue to, yeah, okay, cool. Yep. So it's unique to that block. It just breaks in that block. It doesn't ruin the rest of your CSS. So that's cool. That's good to know. Cool. All right. So now that specificity is, we've kind of laid that out a little bit. Now, let's talk about one other case, such as, let's say, for example, I'm going to make a div. Okay. And I'm going to give this div a BG red, meaning background red class. And I'm going to also give it a background blue class. Now, this seems silly and trivial, but the point is what happens if you have two classes that are conflicting? Because it would seem that by the rules of specificity, so far we haven't talked about that situation. We've only talked about like classes being compared to element selectors or ID selectors. We know that classes, their specificity falls in the middle. But what happens if I have two classes? One that's red, background color, red, and what if I have another one, BG blue, background color blue? Okay, so if we look at this, well, now we've got kind of an interesting problem because they're both classes. So how does specificity apply in this case? Well, let's take a look at what actually happens, and then we'll work backwards. So right now it's got BG red and BG blue. Okay, let's see what this div is, and let's just put a little text in there. Okay, so it's blue. Interesting. So it's just blue. Well, it actually makes perfect sense when you look at the order in which the classes were defined. So we're going to play around with a few things. If you notice, blue was listed second. Well, you know, I'm thinking about this, and it's like, okay, well, what happens? Maybe it's the fact that it's listed second. Well, let's check that out. Let's see what happens if we move that. Okay, so blue is now listed first. Let's see if maybe red gets applied now because it's second. It's a good hypothesis. I think it's a reasonable thing to.
Would you want to
think.
change the order of it in your CSS too, though?
I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah.
Look, it's still blue. So this is a common misconception. The order of these classes don't matter. The order of the classes listed in a class don't matter on the HTML. What matters is the order in which they're defined. So Emily, you're absolutely right. If we want to get this thing to apply to red, we've got to.
Sorry, I didn't mean to
our
ruin the
class
punchline. I
definitions.
genuinely thought you just forgot.
Yeah. What the hell, Emily? What the hell? Just kidding. So
So
that
does it
make
just
sense?
does it just leave off on red? Did it actually change for like a quick second blue? Or did it
No.
just
Yeah,
Okay.
it's not gonna like flash or anything. Yeah, it's just because the styling doesn't get actually applied until after the CSS has already been parsed. So it has already been overridden by the time it gets to the actual displaying stage, the painting part. But yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, so that's kind of one of the more subtle rules of CSS that you want to be aware of. So yeah, that's those are the basics of specificity.
Can I just say why I asked that actually?
Yeah.
What if like for some reason you had like a timer going down and as it went down, maybe in the last 5 seconds it turns to red or something? Like would in that kind of a case, like would you be able to use 2 background colors and 2 classes on like the same div and have them change?
Sure, you just have to remove one of the classes in your timer.
And just give it a, okay.
Yep, you can use JavaScript to remove and add classes.
Yeah, okay, cool.
That would be the
total
proper way to
sense.
do that. Yeah, because you can't really do that with CSS. Or like you can't like, you know, do time when the classes get applied. That's all JavaScript. So let's see here. Okay, so that's specificity. Now there are some cool, I just want to just go over some cool selectors. Maybe you guys have used these before, but it's kind of, these are kind of helpful to know. So there is the comma, which I kind of already did, right? This just means apply to each one of these selectors. If you list selectors right after each other, then, so actually let me just put this as part of this. Okay, so if I were to make an H2, I would expect it to be red, and there it is. It's the smaller guy. It's red. Cool. Okay, commas are really common. Now, there's another type of selector where you actually omit the comma, where you just list them together. And this one is a little trickier, but for example, let's say I have a div and an H1. What this means is any, starting from the selector div, any children or sub-children that matches that selector will have those styles applied. Okay, so let's do, let's choose a different color. Let's do maroon because that's a sexy color. So if I have a div and I have an H1, I'm maroon. So that is useful for when you have some parent selector where you want to, this lets you kind of isolate or encompass the stylings within a particular like parent. So it's useful for if you have like, you know, a header element, and then you want to style things inside of that header, and you want it to be kind of isolated from the rest of your CSS. It's really common when you're doing CSS modules as well. But the important thing to understand is that it is children as well as sub-children. So even if I have another div, so let's say I make a header element and I put this up here, even though H1 isn't a direct child, it's still maroon. Does that answer your question, Shane? Cool. Now, oh, you said kinda. What else can I clarify?
I think your like microphone is busted or something.
Yeah, it's like scratchy. basically, but to answer the question, like, yes, it doesn't matter how many layers down you go, all the layers. So in this example, I've got div and then header and then h1. I could continue adding more divs and it will still be maroon. Whereas, and also notice how this h1, it's overriding the h1 that we have over here. That's because, or this one over here, right? So like by default, all h1 should be red. Whereas this is a slightly more, this is a more specific selector. So therefore it's going to have a higher specificity. So just for kicks, let's see what happens though if I put this above here. Oops. Accidentally. Okay, I'm gonna take out this H2. Okay, so all H1s are supposed to be red. But let's see if moving it up had an effect. Nope, still maroon. That's because it's more specific. So that is a really important distinction, is it's only when two selectors have identical specificity that you have to worry about, or that you have to think about the ordering in which it's defined. Okay, so in this case, because the selector div h1 is more specific than just plain h1, it doesn't matter the order in which you arrange these. The more specific one will still apply. Whereas in the class example over here, since these both have identical specificity, whatever's defined second is going to take precedence. Okay, that's like the most important thing to remember about specificity.
So first of all, can you hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. Does important affect the specificity, or is that just the positioning?
So,
like, or override it? You know, does it?
Yeah. So important is weird. It basically,
like you should never really use it, but.
Yeah. It's looked down. It's generally looked down upon to use important. If you're having to use important, it usually means that you didn't structure your CSS right.
Yeah, I mean, like occasionally,
I
guess it's like if you have a library that,
sure,
that's how I've seen it. But yeah,
that's a good use case for it. But you never want to use important to try to like troubleshoot your CSS.
Yeah.
So yeah, but the way that important works is that it will ignore anything, any other things overriding it. So for example, let's take H1 for example. So we're saying, okay, H1, make sure that the red is important. So look at what just happened. That means that at that level of specificity, red will take precedence. So no matter if there's other things. So right, notice we've got any H1 that has this class H1, even though we're telling it to be blue, nothing will override it. It essentially means it's not overridable. Which is a little more subtle than saying, or it's actually different than saying, enforce this only. That it's actually different. It's a different concept. Saying don't override me is different than saying make me this red no matter what.
So I mean, and not like you should ever do this, is just a thought experiment, but like if you were to add the important to the next code block, would that it wouldn't override the red? Like if you were to add it to the blue?
Yeah, so let's see what happens.
Can I also be a total idiot? Doesn't that also say not important in like code language?
Well, in JavaScript,
that's not an
yes.
idiot. That's actually a pretty funny observation. Yeah,
very
in
funny.
reading that in JavaScript, that says not important. So let's look at what just happened here. So what happened is we just said, hey, hey, H1 classes, you can't be overridden anymore. Or sorry, I should say, this property can't be overridden by anything more specific than this.
So if you were to have swapped if you were to change the order of the class and the element, would that affect things? Like, because you've got the second one on the more specific thing. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure I follow.
Because a class is more specific than an element, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So you've got in the order, you've got the class coming second. So if you were to put the blue everything above the other H1.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So like this.
Yeah.
Because there are different levels of specificity.
So the red doesn't override the blue.
Right. It does. It's not gonna. Yeah, and that has nothing to do with the ordering.
Perfect. Okay.
Because again, it has to do with the specificity. If the specificity is different, then it doesn't matter the order in which they're defined. It's only when they have the same specificity. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool.
I hope I never have to, use two importance like that. So
yeah, this is terrible. This is awful. This is just absolutely awful. This is only to be used in very, 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 no pun intended, specific situations. So, does anybody have any questions before we go into some other stuff? Or is that all making sense? Cool. Oh, I'm sorry. I did want to actually bring up one other type of selector. So just to go along with I showed you the comma delimited selector. I showed you just the space delimited, which is this guy.
Ben, I got a question. I'm sorry, Ben.
Yeah,
Sorry
go
to
ahead.
interrupt you. I got a question. I was just thinking right now. So where all these videos go, I always ask you, and I've been just trying to look for it, and I can't freaking find these things. Where do these videos go? I looked on VSchool YouTube, and I looked on just hitting the Slack channel.
There's a Code Talk playlist in the VSchool YouTube channel.
It's called Code Talk.
Yep.
Okay, I'm gonna find that. I'm gonna find that one. I appreciate it. I'm gonna check it out later. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
All right.
So in addition to the space selector or the space delimiter, I guess, and the comma, there's also this guy. This means direct child. So this is actually similar to this one, whereas this just means only direct children get applied stylings. Okay, so for example, let's do color brown. So we said that anything that's in all H1s that are in a div somewhere get the maroon color. This says any direct descendants of a div that is in H1 gets the stylings applied. Does that distinction make sense? So if we go over here, notice this guy's buried down. I'm going to put another H1 here and say, I'm brown. Let's take a look at what just happened. In fact, let me, just to demonstrate, before we talk about why that just happened, I'm going to comment that out. And, it's the important stuff. I should not have, let me get rid of the important.
Thank you for indulging me in that.
Yeah, of course. Okay. Okay, those both look maroon to me. Let me do a different color. Let's do cyan. Yeah, that's a good color. Okay, so notice what just happened. We've got div H1, I'm cyan.
I think I
Okay.
know why.
Yeah, so we're saying all direct descendants of divs should be cyan, okay? But then we've got this situation over here where it's also, this is now cyan as well. Well, what's going on?
My guess is that it's more specific.
Yep.
So the
Yeah.
and it's also a direct child of a div. So it's like twofold gonna call that.
Yep. So it
Cyan
makes
color.
perfect, yeah, it makes perfect sense that that would work, right? Like let's take out this this first div guy here, this first div h1. We're gonna get rid of maroon. Okay, and what do we get?
Same.
Yeah. So you're right. It's more specific.
But if you
But wait.
wrapped that second H1 in like a P tag or something, I don't think it would call that color cyan for it.
Sorry, say that again.
I said that second H1, if that one was wrapped in something else other than a div, I don't think it would change. I think it would be one of the other H1 colors.
Right. Yeah. Like, yeah, if this was like a section or something, then
The space just
The
is
second one,
direct,
but yeah.
direct descendants, right?
Say what?
If you, the element space element, it's just for direct descendants of that.
That is, no, that's all descendants.
Descendant
So
anywhere.
Wait, yeah,
So
wait.
then that would
that's-
make the maroon is still
You're right. You're right.
under a div.
Actually, you're totally right. Yeah, I did actually just notice that. Let's see here. This actually. You know what? Maybe I could be wrong actually. Now I'm not sure what the difference is between that because I just realized you're right. You just pointed out that. So if I take that out, we're just saying, hey, all H1s that are a descendant of div, that would mean that it would make sense for, it would mean that this one should be cyan, that first one, right?
No, you just changed it.
Oh, right. Oops.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I think that, feel
I
like
was saying put it like a P tag or something on
Yeah.
the second H1, but
well, because, and my thing is that if it is.
Oh
doing
my, oh duh.
all-
I just realized this.
Because the
had a
header
div
is under
here.
a div.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I realized what I was like, wait, I'm pretty sure this is how this works. Okay. Okay, here we go. Here we go. This is, I had before I had a div wrapped around this H1 too. That's why it was crazy. Okay, here we go. So we have a div and we're saying, okay, cyan gets applied to everything. Okay, now this makes more sense. I'm not cyan because this.
Is the arrow
more
direct
specific.
descendant and the space is all descendants?
Yes. Yep. Correct.
Okay.
Okay. So let's look at that. So they're actually, you know what, Emily, I think I was wrong. They have the same specificity.
So then order.
So
does matter.
being-
Yeah, look at that. So you can even, when you hover over a selector or sorry, a delimiter, I think that's what that's called, a delimiter. I'm not actually sure. Notice how it says selector specificity 002. I don't actually know what those numbers mean, to be honest with you.
is that like a
But
score for its
are the same.
specificity?
It must,
It is,
yeah.
yeah. Oh, I read
Yeah.
that recently too.
Yeah,
Like,
I
what
forget
that
what they
means.
mean. But check it out. They have the same specificity. So we have that case that we were just talking about where this has the same specificity as this. So therefore, whatever is defined first is going to, or sorry, whatever gets defined second is going to get its stylings applied. Okay. So in this case, all of my H1s that are inside of divs, regardless of their how far the ancestry is apart from each other, it's always going to be maroon. Whereas if I go like this, now this is going to override this, and there we are. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Cool. So again, this is just an example of the specificity is matching, or the specificity of two selectors match, therefore whatever is defined second is the one that takes priority. That's it. So now I do not have the specificity of all the different selector delineators memorized. You can just hover over them and see it. So it's cool because if you look at the specificity of the class, look, it's 0, 1, 0, whatever that means. I need to look that up because I'm not actually sure. ID.
I'm reading it. I'm reading it right now. I'll let you know if I figure it out.
Cool. Anywho, so that is specificity. And I showed you some of the selectors. There's lots. Like, for example, there's the ampersand. And is it, oh, you know what? That's a, sorry, that's a SCSS syntax. Yeah, so those are the most common ones.
It looks like they stand for, or the first one is classes, then IDs, then tags. Because you can have specificity within like a more specific tag if you've got
Sure,
like
right,
more things.
exactly.
So that's what those 3 numbers are.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Because like for example, I could do this. For example, I could say, okay, within a div, all H1 classes are now cyan. And if you look at this, div is more general than a class, but then we have classes inside of this div that get applied. So that's why that score is now 0, 1, 1 as opposed to what it was before.
And like, is like a p tag more specific than a div?
I don't think so.
Like they don't have those? Okay.
No, because I believe they're the same. I believe all elements by themselves are the same. Yeah. P and div 0, 0, 1, each one.
You get a higher score in tags, I wonder. Or in, yeah, that's weird.
So, so a common thing to do is, okay, so what I want to talk about next is the specificity will sort of tie into this a little bit. But what I want to do is just show you kind of how you want to organize your CSS. People use classes wrong all the time. And I think that's one of the first things I notice with, especially new students, is they don't use classes the most effective way. Usually I see something like this, where, you know, let's say I'm building an app. I've got my header, I've got my H1, and I've got my welcome to my app. Oops, welcome to my app, and then I've got like, I don't know, I've got some menu in here, right? So we've got our section, and this is our menu that has our buttons. It's like homepage and I don't know, contact, and I don't know, services. No, something like this, right? So look at this. Okay, so here's my sweet app. Let me get rid of my stylings. So we have just a nice, cool, right? So like, I see this all the time where you do something like this. Got our app header. Okay, cool. App header title. App header menu. And then all these guys, app header home button. And let's label these other guys. Yeah. Okay, we got our contact, and then we have our services. Okay, so I see this all the time. So for example, app header, well, we know that we want this to be flex, so I'm going to do this, app header display flex, oops, flex, cool, There we go. And then we were like, oh, well, we got to align the things. So let's make them centered. Okay, cool. They look good. But you know what? Let's justify them by space between so that they're evenly spaced. Okay, nice. That looks much better. And then I don't know, let's give it an underline, you know, like a border bottom or something, and we'll do like, I don't know, 3 pixels or something. Oh, duh. Gotta give it a color. So I don't know, black solid. Okay, cool. It's coming along. And then it's like, okay, now we got to get to my each one. So it's like, oh crap. All right, well, let's do our app header title. Is that what I called it? App header title. Okay, and then here it's like, all right, well, I want my font family to be, I don't know, we'll do Lucida Sans, and we'll make it text align center. Okay, cool. And then actually that isn't doing anything because it's a flexbox. Let's do one other thing. We'll give it a color of maroon because again, it's the sexiest color. Okay, sweet. And then just for illustration, okay, then we've got our app header menu. Okay, cool. App header menu, and then it's like, oh, well, we want these guys to be like, oh, I don't know. We want these to be flex as well. And we want them to be, like, I don't know. We'll give them a little bit of we'll give it a little bit of padding, I suppose, you know, no, I don't know, 8 pixels or so. Sweet. And then we want to give them some, that's good. So now we got to say, okay, app header button, or what did I say, app header home button. And then here it's like, okay, well, we want to give a little bit of margin. Okay, cool. And we want to get rid of the background color. We just want this to be transparent. Okay. Okay, now we have to apply this 3 times. Final thing, so we've got a contact button. Then we have our services button. Okay. Sorry, that was painful to watch. Okay, so there's a lot of problems with this. Okay. So the first problem is the fact that we're conflating classes with IDs. We're using a class to identify a single thing in the DOM. You don't want to do that. That defeats the purpose of using a class. A class is meant to be a class of things, a variety of things, right? It's a set. A class is a set of things. So by naming our classes like this, we're confusing this idea of a way of identifying a single thing and being able to apply classes everywhere, right? Because you probably aren't going to have more than one app header. So why use a class, right? You're not going to have one more app header menu, or sorry, you're not going to have multiple app header menus. So why use a class for it? So that's the first. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Like I remember, I think it was Grant, or it might have been Bob, either like when I did the intake or whatever. I remember him saying like very with a lot of conviction that that vSchool took the idea that IDs are only for JavaScript and classes are for CSS. But most people don't actually seem to buy into that from what I've seen. And it seems like you're saying that you don't buy into that concept.
Not necessarily. What I'm saying is that don't use classes to identify individual things. Don't use
you would use-
classes as IDs.
Okay.
I don't care either way. I don't have an opinion on whether you should or shouldn't use IDs. In some of the in SCSS or some of the other, or like less and some of the other CSS preprocessors, you can do some really cool things with IDs, such as kind of creating a self-isolated safe space for anything existing under that ID. I don't have an opinion though on whether you should or shouldn't use IDs in CSS. They can be very useful. And as if you understand specificity and you don't repeat yourself, then I don't see a problem with using IDs. But what I do have a problem with is when you use classes to instead of an ID. So in this is a case where this is very bad practice, because suppose I have another section. So I'm going to create here's the section of my app that has some divs, right? And this, I don't know, this is like a blog page or whatever, blog title, whatever, and like I see this all the time, where it's like blog 1, blog 2, blog 3, right? And then here we're saying, okay, class app blog, I don't know, at blogs. I don't know, I'm running out of ideas here, but now for this, it's like, oh, this is cool. If I wanted to make this like, I don't know, if I wanted to give some padding to this at blogs page, I could say, okay, at blog page padding, I don't know, 6 pixels or something. And then when we look at this, it's like, okay, cool. There's a little bit of padding there. Oh, I called it app blogs. Wrong name. Okay. Now when you look at this, it's like, okay, app blogs. Okay, there's a little bit of padding there. Okay, so, but this is just bad. This is just straight up bad, because the whole purpose of a class is to be a reusable set of attributes. So don't use classes as IDs or as a way of identifying like a very specific part of your code. Okay, the best thing to do is to use classes the way that they're meant to, which is as a set of attributes. That's it. It's just a set of attributes that can be applied to anything. So what would be a better thing to do here? So let's look at, for example, the app header. Okay, we're gonna let's parse this out a little bit. So notice how there is a let's notice some things that are unique and that may not be. How many times do you in your life have you set display flex in a line item center and justify content? How many times have you done that on a given element? A ton of times, right? So it sucks having to rewrite that all over the place, right? Like, why add these 3 lines everywhere when you could just do something like this? I'm going to say, hey, we're going to identify this section as app header, which is the correct thing to do, right? We're saying this is the app header. Okay, cool, great, app header, beautiful. Now, instead of calling this app header, we're just going to give it the classes that it makes sense to give it. So let's think about some useful utility classes, such as, oh, I don't know, centering things. So what we're going to do is we're going to define a class called flex. And again, this can you can call this whatever you want. It should just make sense. What we're going to do is we're going to say, we're going to call this flex space between, SB.
So this is like the tailwind approach, right? Did I get that right? Tailwind?
Oh, I don't
Is
know
that
what it's
that's
called. I'm not sure. I know what you're talking about. I just don't know if that's what it's called. So in this case, what we're doing is we're saying, all right, let's take that little bit, let's take that set of attributes that we know is common, and we're going to group it into its own class. So in this case, I have a flex space between, and we're going to say flex, and we're going to say justify content space between. Okay, cool. Now we also, if we look at this, we also have this align items. So what we'll do is we'll define a class called flex align items, AI. I mean, this isn't the best name. If I spent more time, I could probably think of a better name doing flex AI. That's not really, let's do this, align, let's just do align center. I think that makes sense. So then here we can say, okay, display flex and align items center. Cool. So now what we can do is in our HTML, we don't need to, we can just say, okay, I want you to be flex align center, and I want you to be flex space between. And we have exactly what we wanted before. However, we now have a case of, so if we look at the styles, okay, so this border thing here. Well, now again, this would come down to your style guide, but suppose we want all headers to have this border bottom. Like we have this header definition that says, hey, if you're a header, you have a border. So what we'll do is we'll just say, exploiting specificity, we're just going to say, hey, all headers get this bottom border. So now we have what we wanted, but what's nice is that you can now see how we can start writing less CSS, but we're only applying it to the things we care about and that we need.
You're basically like treating verbose CSS for verbose HTML, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And
it's like a better version of its inline styling almost, I guess, because you're
sort of. The benefit of this though is that you can use JavaScript to add and remove classes at will.
That makes sense.
It's a lot harder to do that in, or it's a lot more tedious to do that with styles in JavaScript. It's not impossible, but you then have to make, the problem with that is that instead of just doing a simple class list.remove or class list.add, you actually have to specify what properties you want to either change, delete, remove, or update.
Yeah, and then I mean, like once you've got your style, you can just move all of that to a utility helper CSS file that you just import every time, and yeah, that's great.
Totally, exactly.
Can you go back to the CSS for just like 1 second?
Yeah.
You defined an ID, but you're not using it. Am I correct?
Yeah, I'm not using it. This is so that like, this is to show that, hey, this particular header is this guy.
So I don't know, and I'm super guilty of what not to do, but only when it came to my most recent project that I know you're familiar with, but only by default, because I think at that point I was burnt out and I just wanted to write it. And my CSS file is ridiculous and I'm embarrassed by it because I know that because I know there's a lot of redundancies and I know it can be for sure improved upon. Why is it that I felt like I couldn't use IDs when I was writing React? Is there some sort of like trickery that I just didn't, or did I just somehow like quickly tell myself that and then go down that wormhole of just using class names?
What was
But
it? I think
sure
I think that what it was is that you were doing it inside of like one of your cards,
Yeah.
like the cat card, and that cat card gets populated multiple times on a cat page element. And in
Mhm.
that case, there would be multiple copies of that same element in that page, and it would be an error.
I'll have to look
Yeah,
at it,
so
but
so what I'm imagining, what you're talking about is you probably had this situation where you had some component, I don't know, like whatever your parent was, probably looked like that, and then inside you were probably doing something like data.map.
I just remember all I used was class names, and
Yeah.
Well, I remember that problem because I'm pretty sure it would have been that it was a card and you've got multiple cards in an element, and so you can't give them an ID because then every card would have the same ID, and that's a problem.
right. But in some other areas, I also used class names. Did I forget to like revisit that thought and just like went with class names, or did I somehow like, okay, let me ask this in a different way, because who cares what I thought or what I did? My question would be, when you're doing, when you're styling a React app,
Mhm.
you can use IDs, correct?
Sure. Yeah,
So
there's
does it
nothing.
look any different when you call that ID in your CSS? It's hashtag.
No,
and the
no,
name
it's
of
all
it,
has
correct?
nothing to do with whether it's React or not, because it's still just JavaScript.
I have no idea what happened to my brain at the end of that project there, but you should take a look at it sometime, because it's a long CSS file with a lot of repetitive.
Yeah.
And I think part of it was because of like some stuff was like based off of state and it had to like switch depending. I don't know. I feel like there was having to be like more logic involved to use IDs versus just giving.
I mean, I just feel like IDs are so risky in React because so much of it is. I mean, you're making components which are meant to be reused over and in different places or lots of times. So by definition, if you use an ID in those, you're setting yourself up to get a problem if you use it twice in the same area.
But I would argue that that's not unique to React. That's just the general problem when you're using IDs.
I guess, but I guess any component-based kind of system.
Sure,
that
right.
Well, long story short is anything that was styled in that application was styled via class name.
And that's fine. Like there's nothing wrong with that.
But like we're saying, like
what we're saying is
style things based on ID.
My point.
Yeah, but I used class names on things that I was styling specifically, like a button or like a specific, I don't know, div or something.
So like what you're saying is that you were doing something like this, where you have like, okay, yeah, and that's a pattern that you want to avoid.
I'm like fully capable of distinguishing between IDs and class names, but for some reason there was something missing when I was doing this React project, where whenever I would go to try to give something an ID, I don't know why I would default to the class name, and
because it's a better practice, pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, you want to use class names. It's not that you were using class names, it's just that you were using class names incorrectly.
So I have a question, like
knowingly, that's a problem.
Yeah.
I didn't.
Well, yeah, but you were just defiantly lazy about it, or not lazy,
that
but
might be
done.
That might be the truth there. The truth comes out.
Can you go back to the HTML for this?
Yeah.
So if you did want to get rid of the blog 1, blog 2, blog 3, and just have them all blogs, would you then do like a child of the selector to get their specificity? Like, how would you target that?
So that's
if you wanted them to be different.
So that's a really good question. So
this will help.
So for example, so let's look at it this way. So we know that we're going to start over the same way that I had kind of looked at this header. Now I didn't finish it, but let's look at this guy. So for example, we know that this section is the blog page for the apps. or sorry, it's the blog page for like the app is what we're saying. So that means that it would make more sense to identify this as my app blog page or something. This isn't entirely necessary, but I do like using IDs for very, very specific parts of an app. It's just you don't want to
Agreed,
overuse
and that's
IDs.
why it killed me to only be using class names for
Right.
that. I don't know.
So, but now what we have here is an example of, okay, so we've got we've identified our app blog page. We have this section, and then we have class. So the question is, what do we put here? Now, my argument in general is to say that you should put your classes, you should implement whatever classes are, or like I treat classes as just utility functions in a way. They're just, a class is just a set of styles. And if I want to make something look a particular way, then I'm just going to compose those classes in a way that achieves my desired result. So in this case, for example, if I'm making let's say I want this to be like I don't know, like a grid, right? Where it's like a 3 by X grid, meaning it's three columns and however many rows, right? So like, let's make this a little longer. Okay, so now one way to do that would be to, well, okay, before I get there, I want to address Shane's comment, which is like, okay, what's the best way to style this? Just like, what's the best way to style this? We have some options. We can
I guess
define,
like specifically, if you, presumably you wanted each of those to look different, right? That's why you gave them a different class originally, like blog 1, blog 2, blog 3? Or was that not?
I did that as an example of showing what not to do.
Yeah. So instead, like, how would you target that the second blog looks different than the first blog, et cetera?
Right. So that would be, I would do it, I would target it using classes first. So for example, let's talk about just the most general ones first. So we know that this is going to be a grid, okay? So what we'll do is we'll say that this is a flex box, right? So what we could do is something like this, which I don't like doing. Something like this, which is, okay, here's our app blogs and our app blog page, I mean. And then I can be like, okay, look at this, display flex, and then we'll just say anything that's a direct descendant, or not a direct descendant, but any blog that's in there, we're gonna say width 33% or something. Wait, not that. What did I do? What am I forgetting? It's got to be exactly. Oh, flex wrap. Forget about that. Okay, here we go. Okay, the problem with this is that, to me, this is something that should be abstracted away into some sort of utility class. The app blog page is not, it's not so, this set of stylings is probably not unique to the app blog page. Okay? It's probably going to be very common to see some div or section or whatever that has those stylings. So why repeat ourselves when we can just do something like this? We can just say, we'll say flex wrap. We'll just make a class flex wrap. Okay, cool. And then here, instead of saying, you know, at blog page blog, because again, we're conflating a general class with a unique ID. These blogs are probably not the only element that are going to get a 33% width applied. So what makes more sense would be to do something like this. Flex column 3. And you could go ahead and make flex column 1, flex column 2, flex column 4, 5, 6, whatever you want. And then just apply that. So I'll take that out. Oops. Yeah, so what I do, width 33%. You could also do, I believe flex 0.3 would also work. So then what we can do is we can go to our thing here and say, okay, you are this at blog page. We're going to apply the flex wrap class. And we're going to apply the flex column 3 to each blog page. And again, notice how I'm not even going to be using that blog class anymore, because it doesn't matter that that's a blog. What matters is what styles we're applying to it. So in this case, we're going to say flex column 3, and then we'll just go ahead and make a few copies of these.
See, like, I feel like I mean, I get the logic, but you're also trading in like one line of CSS for repeating a line over and over and over again in your HTML.
Right, but this is so much easier to do when, so first of all, you would rarely manually write these out, right? This would be the result of a map if you were doing it in React.
Okay.
So it wouldn't be multiple repeated lines. It would be one line that you map through.
That makes sense, yeah.
But then you achieve this nice grid pattern. And what's nice is that if I wanted to just somehow change this, if I wanted to use a two, let's say this is we want to make this responsive. Well, this becomes super easy because now all I have to do is apply a flex column 1 and then tell my media query, what is it? At media, min width, I'll say 600 pixels. Or I guess this would be
if you put the media query, or like if the media query targeted the flex 3, you know, that one that they all shared.
Right. Yeah, totally. So for example, we could say in fact, I'm going to call this flex column. I'm going to make a generic flex column. And then what we'll do is we'll say, okay, flex column is going to be, we'll say at 600 pixels, it's 50%. At 900 pixels, it will be 33%. And now when we go to our HTML over here, get rid of these guys. Flex column. When we go over here, check it out.
Nice.
So it's 50%, now it's 33%, now it's 100%. And you know, you could there's several different ways to implement that pattern, but now you can kind of see how useful it is to just have, it's better to have lots of individual classes that just have several, like maybe 2 to 3 sets of attributes than it is to have one big class with 50 attributes. It's very difficult to like your CSS becomes unmanageable at that point.
So what you're saying is I have to go back and rewrite all the CSS I've ever written.
Yeah,
Yeah.
basically. That's the
Yes.
purpose of today. So now in a real, like in a real application, let me show you just kind of like a pattern that you might see. Now, normally you'd have multiple CSS files. You'd have, there'd probably be a CSS preprocessor and stuff. It can get pretty crazy. But let me just show you just like for your projects that you're using. This will be a good pattern to use, and it'll be really useful. So for example, what I would do is start out with your most specific things first. So this means I want you to think about it from the theme level. Okay, so start out with most specific stylings first. Okay, so this would be doing stuff like this: H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, maybe H6, and then P tag, maybe some spans. And this would be doing something like font family, picking your fonts. Okay, having your colors selected. So doing stuff like
Yeah,
can
I
use
definitely
CSS
rewrote that
variables.
font family like 5 times.
Yeah, and this right here in one line will
Yeah.
take care of all that. And then if you have different fonts for different sizings, that's totally cool too. You can split these up. But you can define your colors, right, for your text colors.
Well, here,
You
that's
can
a
define.
thought. Like, say you do want to have like different text sizes for some of those, and you have
Mhm.
you have to write them a class name anyway just to do that. Why not just throw the font family in there? Or it's still better practice that if you know that all of these are going to be the same.
So what you can do is you can either use specificity, or you can exploit specificity to say like, oh, hey, you know what? If you are a small text, then I'm going to say font size, I don't know, 12 RAM, or not 12 RAM, like 1 RAM. And then you can make several other ones for just size of your text. So if you want to get more specific, you can start with your defaults, right? So you know that now H1, H2, H3, etc., those all have their default font sizes and stuff, right? But if you want to change them, you can, right? You could say, start out with only H1s, and I want to say, you know what? I want my font size of this guy to be 64 pixels. But if for whatever reason you decide later on that you have an H1, but there isn't really another use for it, or you really need to use an H1, but you want it to have a smaller font size, use a class to override its default. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So then,
Oh, yeah. I
yeah,
muted and said yes.
Okay, cool. So this section would be all of your defaults at the element level. Okay, so we haven't even talked about classes yet. You want to start out with like, okay, what should all of my sections look like? What should all of my what are the base stylings for like a div? For example, what's my default padding? Things like that. So then these are things you have to worry about later. You can basically.
What's funny to me is that you're styling the most specific stylings first with the least specific way to style something.
Yes, that's
Okay.
exactly right. We're saying all H1s should look like this.
Unless we tell you later
Unless
that
later on in your
Unless
CSS,
later on,
you
yes.
do something different. Ah,
Correct.
this is genius. Okay.
Yes.
This is
And
great. I gotta go soon. Sorry.
yeah, and then
Just in case I leave.
for example, a header. And the thing is, what I would highly recommend is once you've built out your like wireframe of a project or whatever, identify what each element is in your like drawing, like be like name them, like, okay, this is a header, this is a div, this is a section, this is a h1, this is a p tag, this is a span. You don't have to like identify like literally every single element, but just categorize it the best you can. So then that way ahead of time, you don't need to worry about styling like literally every single DOM element you can think of. You can just be like, okay, I know that my app is built up of this set of elements. So I'm gonna kind of start there. I'm gonna start my style guide from there. And then
Do
go ahead.
design students go like do they even know what a div is, or you know what I mean? Like, do they talk about CSS sections like that? Like, they're not going to divide it up for us.
I have
in
no
their-
idea.
Yeah.
They'll probably call it, I doubt that they would use HTML semantics.
Okay.
But what's nice about HTML is that you can create your own semantic HTML tags. So like,
You do that often? Like,
mhm.
that's something that's like interesting. I've never actually I've never done it.
Yeah. I wouldn't say often, but I definitely do. They're cool. Definitely useful. So like, and this just kind of comes down to, this is what's cool about CSS is that the way that you
Oh, that's not a
define
phrase
it-
you hear often.
Yeah, and this is coming from someone who hates CSS. Like I'm not a fan. It's not
But your
that,
CSS is so wonderful. Like this
but
is,
that's because I love making pretty code.
I know.
I
and
like-
I think
Yeah.
that you are so high. Like I love how highly skilled you are in getting me to compartmentalize my thinking and then therefore my coding. And I think like compartmentalized, super clean, readable code is like,
Yeah.
it's so satisfying.
It's
Oh
art.
yeah, and then you solve the problem
Yeah.
quicker, and then you feel
Yeah,
smarter.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I
Yeah.
feel like people have,
But I can do it in one line.
but you can do it in one line.
Like, yeah,
Shane.
but I can't read it and I can't test
I know.
it.
I would love just like a quick scope into Shane's brain. I
You
always
don't.
say
Trust
people,
me, you don't.
I was just gonna say when people have said that to me in the past, I'm always like, no, trust me. The second you get in, you're gonna be
Yeah.
screaming
Like-
to get out.
Like, how much therapy does your insurance cover?
Okay, hey, I really wish I could stay as long as this ran out. I gotta go. This
Okay.
is so great.
Yeah, you're
But-
welcome.
Jesus. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm really
no problem.
excited. I'm glad I came to this one. I keep meaning to, and I'm going to come to a lot more of these.
Well,
It's
I'm
great.
not ending it for anyone. I'm sorry. I
Yeah,
have
no,
to
it's not
go.
over. There's still more stuff to talk about.
Fantastic.
Just know I don't want to go. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Have a great night. I'll talk to you
yeah.
all later.
Yeah,
Hi.
hit me up this week if you
I
need
will.
help on stuff.
Absolutely.
Cool.
Okay. I'm sorry about the car.
That's all right. It's just a
All right. Yeah. It'll get better. You're fine. Okay. Bye, guys.
Okay, see ya. All right, let's see here. Where was I? Okay, so, all right, so you generally want to start out with your most general like elements first. Come up with like some loose style guide for all the basic components of your app. And you can use CSS variables and stuff too to kind of make your life easier. Like for example, you can define your like font sizes and like your padding metrics, your border width, like stuff like that. You can just define in variables. So that way you can then write once and then use them everywhere. So you don't have to like change them in 1,000 places just because you decided, crap, I don't like the padding on this. It's too small or something.
You're basically making like a customized version of like the normalized concept,
Right.
like resetting things, basically.
Kind of, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, like there's a particular method, I forget, it's called the BEM. Is that what it's called? BEM? BEM?
Yeah. I tried to do that, and then I realized I just didn't have the discipline. But
Yeah,
I
like
should. Yeah.
yeah, and I mean it's useful. But what I care about rather than and this is just a general principle that I like to follow, which is I'm not going to follow some set of rules just for the sake of following the set of rules. I want to understand what the benefits and advantages are of that system. And if I like it, or if it's, or I should say, if it works for what I'm trying to accomplish, then I'll use it.
If
I'll
your
follow
boss
it.
likes it. Yeah.
Right.
If your team.
Right. And if it makes sense and if it's easy to implement and if it solves the problem, then yeah, use that system. But sometimes not every system is going to be applicable to every solution. So it's more important to understand, what the benefits and advantages are of a given system so that you can make those changes and tweaks as you see fit. Like this is not really following any particular system, but the principle of it, which is don't repeat yourself, isolate sets of attributes based on their applicability in multiple places. Those are pretty reasonable rules to follow, I think. And you can, build up your system on that.
So do you personally have like a file of utility classes that you use frequently that you just pull in to projects, or do you do this for every project you start and define these things?
Yeah, it depends on what the project is. Like there are classes that I use quite a bit. Like if I know that I'm going to be using Flexbox all the time, and I know I'm going to be using Grid all the time. But the problem is that, it depends, depending on the application, I may not be able to just use my CSS or whatever. And also, like, I like to use some of the theming libraries out there that are really cool. Like Theme UI is really awesome because you get a nice baseline of things that you don't have to like start at such a low level like this, because they some of those base themes already have a lot of that written, and then you just need to write classes that are useful for your particular application. So you end up not actually really writing that many or that much CSS. Like I've used Material UI, they have some cool themes, stuff like that. But I think going through this process at least once can be really illuminating, because then you see how like Bootstrap works. Like this is basically how Bootstrap works, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's literally all Bootstrap is just a set of pre-existing classes that you can apply at will.
Yeah.
It's just that sometimes that's overkill and you may not need all of Bootstrap.
So I have a kind of meta question, I guess, and I've gotten a lot of non-answers from people on this.
Okay.
But in your opinion, when you're building up a portfolio and you've got portfolio pieces on there,
Yeah.
is it a better strategy, job hunt wise, or to take the time to actually like tediously write out the CSS without a library, or to show that you know how to do that, or is just the fact that it got done all that matters? Like is using a library considered in any way like cheating, or taking the easy road for jobs?
I would argue that it's all about how you defend yourself and how you justify your decision.
Okay.
If you can speak intelligently to why you chose a library and to how it worked and what you did to figure out how to make it work for your situation, that's pretty impressive. I don't like if I see someone's app that looks like amazing, like it's responsive and it's beautiful and it's just crisp and clean, but if they can't tell me how they got it to work, and you can just tell that all they did was like download some templates and kind of just hack it all together, that's not going to be as impressive to someone whose app looks basic but is also structured intelligently.
Okay.
And then they can tell me, you know, if someone can explain their decisions and their process, I don't care what they did to achieve that personally.
That's the best answer so far.
I mean, that would be my argument, you know, like, cause it's all about explaining and describing the process that you use to get to the solution to your problem. You know, that's what you get hired for, is the ability to solve problems, but also explain it to other people.
Perfect. So I do want to point out, you never actually answered my question that the original thing I was asking about the, if you wanted the, I don't even remember what they're called anymore, but in the
The
HTML.
blog things.
Yeah, like, so my instinct would say, like, if you wanted them to each look different, could you would target can you do like the ID app log page, and then like nth child, like you can do that on IDs, right? Not just elements.
Yeah, you can do so. Yeah, so this question is tricky because it totally depends on if there is a logic to how your differences are. Like, is it every other that you need to make unique? Is it like you don't know ahead of time what's unique? Like,
Yeah.
you know, but okay, so I can imagine there's some situations, a common situation would be like, you know, one of these
They
things,
progressed in the hues or something like that to make a rainbow, you know.
sure, yeah, like, so there, what you can do is, you could say, like, app blog page,
I guess the larger question, just like you're answering great, but the to let you know, the follow up, I guess, is basically, is it better to do that somehow through CSS stuff or through JavaScript and within the map? Like, would you identify the differences as you created the elements?
What I would do is I would apply the classes dynamically. I would create the classes that you know are necessary. Like, for example, like this rainbow pattern you're talking about, right? So instead of trying to do it in CSS here, because, like, you know, you can imagine, I would imagine that maybe that list gets longer potentially, or what happens if we reorder or resort this list? What happens if we want to add new colors, new things? What would make sense to me is, instead of managing that here, which would, this would be a pretty brittle way to do it, unless you, again, it depends on how complex this is. But yeah, rather than doing it here with nth child and stuff, it would make way more sense to be like, okay, what's my what are the unique classes that would be necessary to achieve this solution? So, for example, if I'm making like a rainbow, I could make classes called red, blue, what is it, orange? I'm thinking like roijibiv, et cetera, et cetera. And then
That's not a rainbow, by the way. That's not the order.
Oh, sorry, that's the,
but I like
that's
it. But I like
color,
that.
the color spectrum, right? Is it the,
Well, I mean, red to blue to orange is nowhere in anything. But
visible
no,
light spectrum, isn't roijibiv the visible light spectrum? Or am I just tripping?
it might be. I have no idea, but I do know. I mean, I do a lot of light art, but I know that you take yellow light and red light and you get orange. And you take red light and green light and you get yellow. You know, they're in between.
Right.
You know, so you would never go from red to blue to orange.
Well, right. I'm not. The order doesn't matter. I'm just saying, like,
oh,
these
gotcha.
are the classes that I
of
would
course.
create. Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Order doesn't matter. I'm not writing this in any particular order.
Of course.
I'm just saying, if we were doing some sort of rainbow effect, we could, what we would do is we would want to come up with like, okay, the base class for all of these, which would be like, you know, the sets of just like the very, very generic stylings that are going to get applied to everything, whatever those may be. Apply those, and then we can then add or subtract unique classes related to whatever we're trying to accomplish. So in this case, if we're doing red and blue, we could be like, background color red, background color blue, background color orange, etc. And then in your map, whatever your rule is for applying that CSS class, you just invoke it.
Okay.
So
I have a question, like in the rainbowy thing, if this question is both like in terms of if this is good practice and how it would actually work specificity wise, if you were to do an inline style for each of those and then just use a formula to make it a gradient type thing. Does that inline style, where does that land in overriding things? Does that override a class?
Inline style is the most specific. I'm glad you asked that because I forgot to mention that earlier. When you do an inline style, that overrides pretty much everything.
And so for something like that, that's an appropriate use of an inline style mixed with.
Yeah, because that would be, when you're talking about like gradients and stuff, like CSS would not be very good at that.
Okay.
Especially if like, if you're changing the gradient dynamically by like a 0.5 percentage point at a time, like you're not going to want to write 10,000 CSS classes.
Yeah. Okay.
And plus that's slow. So like the style would be a better way to do that.
Cool.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm glad you asked that. Style tags are the most specific. Let's see here. So now everything that we talked about today obviously can be applied to the preprocessors, less Sass and SCSS, stuff like that. The same principle applies, obviously. It's just some of those preprocessors are cool because they come in with like utility functions, so you can actually kind of almost code your CSS as if it were a real programming language in a certain sense, which is kind of cool. But the same principle applies, use classes correctly. Don't use IDs unless you really know why you're using an ID. Or I should say only use IDs for like unique things. And yeah, any other questions?
No, now the trick is just to be motivated to actually apply these rules. Because I know in the long run it's what it's good, but
yeah, because I mean the less CSS you have to write, the better. Because I hate writing CSS.
All my styling is so impulsive though. That's the problem.
Yeah, I know.
I have a hard time like looking ahead at what I want. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why like having if I had like my own personal little pocket designer, that'd be so sweet. Yeah. I wouldn't have to design anything. I could just be given designs. I'd be like, okay, cool, I'll make that.
I mean, I feel like I've never heard anybody in this program be like, I love writing CSS. Yeah, so that makes me feel like I really should focus on like mastering that, since everybody else is not. Like, there's got to be a marketable skill. It
is for sure. Definitely underrated skill. It's hard to have both JavaScript chops and CSS chops. Like there's some crazy stuff you can do with CSS.
Oh, like some of the code pen stuff is beautiful. And I love P5.js and doing animations and stuff that way. But I feel like that's so not actually practical. And you're only going to use that if you're making a visualization. You're not going to apply those in
Right. Yeah. Exactly. But yeah, I don't know. It's about finding what is interesting. I stopped worrying about what I should learn a long time ago. Okay. I just thought, what am I interested in? What seems cool? I'm just gonna do that.
And that serves you well in the market?
Well, I have a job.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, because I mean, when you're forced to learn something, you have no choice, right? If there's stuff at work there's stuff at work that comes up that I've never done before, and I never had an interest in it particularly, but it wasn't from lack of interest so much as just I had never thought to check, or I'd never had a reason to look at it. And then when I checked that, I was like, oh, this is cool, and I learned it.
Especially if you're in a team and you're doing like, you have real life context and you're I feel like you'd pick it up very quickly, more than just
Right.
like going through examples and
Right.
stuff.
Yeah. Like that's the hardest part is when like, it's like, okay, I'm going to go learn Jenkins. And it's like, okay, well, what are you going to learn it for? It's like,
Yeah.
well, I'm going to learn Docker. It's like, okay, cool. What are you going to apply that to? It's
Yeah,
really
so
without
like,
context.
is having a long list of those things on your resume or your LinkedIn or whatever, like, is that valuable in a job hunt? Or,
No.
okay.
I don't think so. I mean, I think it's good to have, you should have some familiarity with some of them, I guess. Like you should be able to at least say what they do or like what they're for. But the problem is that just because you've used Docker in the past or something doesn't mean that even if the
use it
company
well.
uses Docker, you don't know how they're using it. Like I know Redux really, really, really well. And when I was asked about Redux, and I was asked about Redux in like my job interview, and I explained it really well and stuff. And they're like, "Yeah, we use Redux, and it's cool." And I get the job, and I start working, and I look at the way that they implemented Redux, and I was like, "This is garbage. This is the worst implementation of Redux I've ever seen in my life." And I teach beginners.
That's funny, huh?
So like, I don't
So
know,
in that
man.
context, do you just go with it and you adapt to their style, or did you
You kind
try
of
to
have
fight
to
it?
because it's like
Yeah.
thousands of lines of code. You don't have time to rewrite that stuff. Like, yeah, I don't know. It's its own thing. There's some days where I'm really frustrated because I just have to deal with crappy code. But
And Redux is like Nuxt, or are those similar, or am I Nuxt? Is that what it is?
I don't
I don't know.
think
It's like a
they're
view
related.
thing.
I thought
Are
Nux
those
was maybe Nux is a
state
view.
management? Is it?
It's state management, but I thought Nux was just an implementation of Redux on Vue. But I could be
Okay.
wrong.
Okay. Yeah. That's. I think that is the case. Okay. That's perfect.
Yeah. But yeah.
Well, thank you. That's been incredibly informative. I
Yeah, good. I'm
personally
glad.
appreciate it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, if you guys don't have any other questions, then we'll just pick up next week. Next week, I'm excited for because it'll be a little bit different than what we've been doing. Normally, I pick like a specific topic and we just kind of like go over it. But next week, the topic is the art of abstraction. I'm a philosophy major. That's what my so I'm gonna nerd out a little bit on just some like ideas I have about abstraction and coding and stuff. So I think it'll just be fun. It'll be more of a philosophical conversation than it will be like me telling you guys information. So I think it'll be cool.
And these are done every Monday at
Every Monday at 4
Mountain
Mountain
Time.
State
Yeah.
time.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Awesome. I will be
Yep.
a regular. Thank you so much.
Cool. You're welcome.
Cool. I'll see you later.
Cool.